In the spring of 1941, a small port town on the Libyan coast became the place where Erwin Rommel's reputation for invincibility met its first serious challenge. Tobruk was nothing special, a modest harbour surrounded by miles of empty desert, a place most people had never heard of and fewer still could locate on a map. But for 8 months, this unremarkable port held the distinction of being the only place in North Africa where the Afrika Korps was stopped cold, where Rommel's lightning advances ground to a halt against a defensive perimeter manned largely by Australian troops who refused to surrender, no matter how desperate their situation became. The defenders endured 241 days of siege, cut off from overland supply routes bombed daily by the Luftwaffe, shelled constantly by German artillery, and attacked repeatedly by forces that had swept everything else before them. They survived on minimal water in temperatures that reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit, lived in holes, scraped into rock-hard ground, and responded to every German attack with aggressive counterattacks that earned them a nickname they wore with fierce pride, the Rats of Tobruk. This is the story of the siege that halted Rommel's drive into Egypt, the garrison that refused to break, and the defence that proved the Desert Fox could be beaten. To understand why Tobruk mattered so much, you need to understand North African logistics and the geography that made desert warfare so difficult. The coastal road running from Egypt westward through Libya was the only practical supply route for any army operating in this region. Parallel to this road ran a single railway line that ended at Tobruk, making the port absolutely critical for supplying forces further west. Any army advancing east from Libya toward Egypt needed to either capture Tobruk or leave substantial forces behind to contain it, because a functioning port in enemy hands directly on your supply line was an intolerable threat. Conversely, any army defending Egypt needed to hold Tobruk as far forward as possible, both to threaten Axis supply lines and to avoid giving the enemy a forward port from which to supply further advances. When Rommel arrived in North Africa in February 1941, the situation seemed desperate for the Axis. The Italians had been routed by a much smaller British force, losing all of Libya and retreating into Tunisia. Rommel was sent with just 2 divisions, not nearly enough for a major offensive by conventional standards. But he immediately recognized that British forces were overstretched, that most of their experienced troops had been withdrawn to fight in Greece, and that the units remaining in Libya were scattered and poorly coordinated. In March and early April 1941, Rommel launched what was supposed to be a limited advance, but that quickly turned into a stunning offensive that recaptured all of Libya and pushed British forces back to the Egyptian border. It was classic Rommel, aggressive, opportunistic, achieving far more with limited forces than should have been possible. But Tobruk held, the British command recognizing the port's strategic importance and fearing that abandoning it would allow Rommel to advance all the way to Egypt, ordered the garrison to defend the town regardless of what happened elsewhere. The force that would conduct this defence was built around the Australian 9th Division veterans, who had trained in Australia for months before deploying to North Africa and who had seen limited combat in Libya before the German arrival. These were not elite troops by European standards. They were citizen soldiers, many from rural backgrounds, who had volunteered to fight a war on the other side of the world. But they were tough, resourceful, and led by officers who understood that defence didn't mean passive sitting in trenches waiting to be attacked. The Tobruk perimeter was based on defensive positions the Italians had built when they controlled the town, a ring of concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and barbed wire obstacles roughly 30 miles in circumference surrounding the port. The defences were substantial but incomplete, designed to protect against attack from the east when the Italians expected the British to attack, but less developed on the western and southern approaches that Rommel would actually use. The terrain was terrible for defence, flat rocky desert, with almost no natural cover, no water sources, and temperatures that made prolonged exposure deadly. The defensive positions themselves were crude concrete pillboxes that became ovens in the daytime, heat trenches that had to be blasted out of rock-hard ground with explosive sangars, stone walls built where digging was impossible. This was where the Australians would spend the next 8 months. Rommel's first serious attempt to take Tobruk came in mid-April 1941, immediately after his forces surrounded the town. He believed the garrison would surrender quickly once they realized they were cut off, or that a determined assault would break through the defensive perimeter before the defenders could organize. He was wrong on both counts. The Australian defenders had no intention of surrendering, and the defensive perimeter, while imperfect, was strong enough to stop hasty attacks. German forces attacked on April the 13th and 14th, achieving some initial penetrations, but being stopped by fierce resistance and counterattacks that drove them back with heavy casualties. Rommel tried again on April 30th with a more carefully planned assault after artillery and air bombardment, but this attack was also repulsed with significant German losses. These early battles established patterns that would define the entire siege. The Germans attacked with characteristic aggression and tactical skill, but they were operating at the end of long supply lines with limited artillery ammunition and fuel. The defenders fought from prepared positions, had their own artillery concentrated in support, and most critically were willing to counterattack aggressively rather than just absorbing German pressure. Every German penetration was met with immediate Australian counterattacks, often hand-to-hand fighting in trenches and bunkers that either drove the Germans back or prevented them from exploiting their gains. The fighting was vicious and personal, conducted at ranges where men could see each other's faces, where grenades and bayonets mattered as much as artillery, where individual courage and small unit leadership determined outcomes. The conditions the defenders endured were almost as dangerous as the combat itself. Tobruk in summer is one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Daytime temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit and could reach 120 or higher. There was no shade except in the bunkers, which became unbearable ovens in the afternoon. Water was desperately scarce, the town had no natural water sources, and every drop had to be brought in by ship, then transported to forward positions under constant threat of air attack and artillery fire. Water rations were minimal, measured in pints per man per day, just barely enough to prevent death from dehydration, but not enough to prevent constant thirst and heat exhaustion. The men learned to move only at night to find whatever shade existed during the day, to make water last through endless scorching hours, when every movement produced sweat that the body couldn't afford to lose. The flies were legendary. Thousands, millions of flies attracted by unwashed bodies, rotting food, human waste, and the inevitable casualties of warfare. The flies covered everything: food, water, faces, wounds. They were impossible to avoid and carried diseases that caused constant dysentery and other illnesses that weakened men already stressed by heat, minimal rations and combat. The defenders learned to eat with one hand while using the other to constantly brush flies away, to sleep with faces covered, to accept that flies would be in their mouths and noses, and there was nothing to be done about it. Veterans of Tobruk remembered the flies as vividly as they remembered the combat and ever-present torment that made every moment of every day miserable. Living conditions were primitive beyond anything these men had experienced. The forward defensive positions were holes in the ground, sometimes reinforced with concrete or sandbags, but often just crude excavations in the rocky desert floor. Men lived in these positions for days or weeks at a time, sleeping on the ground, cooking whatever rations they had over small fires, defecating into tins that had to be buried or removed, living with the constant stench of unwashed bodies in confined spaces. The bunkers provided some protection from artillery and air attack, but were suffocatingly hot during the day, turning into concrete ovens that reached temperatures well over 100 degrees, even when the outside air cooled slightly. Men would spend afternoons lying motionless in these bunkers, conserving energy and water, waiting for the sun to set so they could resume activity. The Luftwaffe bombed Tobruk almost daily, targeting the harbour facilities, supply dumps, and defensive positions with attacks that ranged from small raids to massive strikes involving hundreds of aircraft. The Stuka's German dive bombers were particularly terrifying, screaming down from altitude, with sirens wailing, releasing bombs that could destroy bunkers or create craters that buried defenders alive. The defenders had anti-aircraft guns, but they were never enough to stop determined air attacks. Men learned to recognize the different sounds of aircraft engines, to distinguish between reconnaissance flights and actual attacks, to know when to run for cover and when they could risk staying in position. The psychological toll was constant, even when bombs weren't falling. The threat of air attack was always present, forcing constant vigilance and preventing any sense of safety. German artillery added to the siege's misery. Rommel's forces positioned guns around the Tobruk perimeter and conducted regular harassing fire against defensive positions, supply routes, and the harbour. The shelling was rarely intense enough to be called a proper bombardment. Rommel lacked the ammunition for sustained barrages, but it was constant enough to be deadly and demoralising. Random shells would land in defensive positions or on tracks used for supplies, killing or wounding men who couldn't predict when or where the next round would fall. This random violence was psychologically exhausting, creating constant tension because there was no safe area, no moment when you could completely relax, no way to avoid the possibility that the next shell would have your name on it. What made the Tobruk defence remarkable wasn't just that the garrison endured these conditions, but that they remained aggressively offensive throughout the siege. The Australian commanders, particularly General Leslie Morshead, who commanded the 9th Division, believed that purely passive defence would eventually fail, that sitting in positions and waiting for German attacks would allow Rommel to mass forces and break through at a point of his choosing. Instead, Morshead instituted what he called an aggressive defence, conducting constant patrols and raids against German positions, keeping the enemy off balance, gathering intelligence, and maintaining the psychological advantage that comes from attacking rather than just defending. These night attacks, called sallies by the defenders, became a defining characteristic of the Tobruk siege. Almost every night, Australian patrols would move out from the defensive perimeter into no man's land, probing German positions, laying ambushes, conducting raids against supply dumps or artillery positions. The attacks were small-scale, usually company or platoon-sized operations, but they were frequent and effective. German forces surrounding Tobruk could never relax, never assume that darkness meant safety. They had to maintain constant vigilance, post extra sentries, and divert resources to defending against attacks that came without warning from unexpected directions. The sallies served multiple purposes beyond their immediate tactical effects. They maintained offensive spirit among defenders who might otherwise have become demoralized by the siege conditions. They provided intelligence about German positions and intentions that couldn't be gained from passive observation. They disrupted German planning and forced Rommel to keep more troops around Tobruk than he wanted, troops that could otherwise have been used for operations further east. And perhaps most importantly, they established psychological dominance. The defenders were attacking the besiegers, reversing the normal dynamic of siege warfare, and demonstrating that the Australians weren't passive victims, waiting to be overwhelmed, but dangerous enemies who would fight aggressively at every opportunity. The tactics of these night operations were based on stealth, surprise, and violence. Patrols would move out after dark, navigating by compass and landmarks across terrain they had studied during daylight hours. They travelled light rifles, grenades, minimal equipment, because speed and stealth mattered more than firepower. The approach to German positions would be slow and silent sometimes, taking hours to cover a few hundred yards with scouts checking ahead for sentries and obstacles. The attack itself would be sudden and overwhelming, grenades thrown into bunkers, rifle fire at point-blank range, hand-to-hand fighting in trenches, and then immediate withdrawal before German reinforcements could respond. The entire operation, from leaving the Australian lines to returning, might take several hours, with the actual combat lasting only minutes. These operations were extraordinarily dangerous, and casualties were inevitable, but they achieved their objectives. German units around Tobruk reported constant harassment, complained about inability to rest or resupply safely, and had to maintain force levels higher than would otherwise be necessary for a static siege. Rommel himself became frustrated with the situation, repeatedly demanding that Tobruk be taken, but unable to commit the forces necessary for a successful assault because those forces were needed elsewhere, and because the aggressive Australian defence made even maintaining the siege costly. The strategic importance of Tobruk became more apparent as Rommel tried to advance further into Egypt. Every supply convoy that reached his forward forces had to travel past Tobruk within range of British artillery and air attacks from the besieged port. The Royal Navy and RAF conducted regular supply runs to Tobruk, bringing in ammunition, food, and replacement troops, while evacuating wounded and reinforcing defensive positions. These supply operations were hazardous. Ships had to run the gauntlet of German air attacks, both coming and going, and many vessels were damaged or sunk, but they kept the garrison supplied and demonstrated that Tobruk was not actually cut off despite being surrounded on land. The logistical situation created a bizarre dynamic where Rommel was simultaneously besieging Tobruk and being threatened by it. His supply lines ran past a functioning enemy port. His forces were insufficient to both maintain the siege and conduct offensive operations further east. Every attack on Tobruk consumed ammunition and casualties he couldn't afford, but leaving Tobruk alone allowed the garrison to threaten his rear areas. It was a strategic nightmare, and it was exactly what British commanders had hoped for when they decided to hold Tobruk rather than withdraw the garrison. Through the summer and fall of 1941, the siege settled into a grinding routine, punctuated by periodic German attacks and constant Australian aggression. The defenders endured the heat, the flies, the shelling, and the bombing while maintaining their patrols and counterattacks. The Germans probed for weaknesses, launched occasional assaults to test defences, and subjected the garrison to constant pressure while becoming increasingly frustrated at their inability to take a town that by all conventional military logic should have fallen months earlier. Both sides suffered steady attrition, not from major battles, but from the accumulated casualties of daily combat disease accidents and the simple physical toll of operating in such terrible conditions. The defenders' nickname, the Rats of Tobruk, came from German propaganda. Nazi radio broadcasts referred to the trapped garrison as rats hiding in holes, attempting to demoralize the defenders by emphasizing their isolation and desperate situation. The Australians embraced the name immediately and proudly recognizing that rats are tough, resourceful survivors who thrive in adverse conditions. The nickname became a badge of honor, something that distinguished the Tobruk veterans from other troops and that carried connotations of toughness and endurance that perfectly matched how the defenders saw themselves. After the war, veterans formed the Rats of Tobruk Association, ensuring that the nickname and the legend it represented would be preserved. By late 1941, political and military pressures were building to relieve the siege. The Australian government was concerned about the toll on Australian troops and wanted their divisions withdrawn from what seemed like a static and costly situation. British commanders recognised that the garrison, while holding successfully, was being worn down by months of siege and would need relief eventually. The strategic situation was also changing. British forces were preparing for a major offensive, Operation Crusader, that would attempt to destroy Rommel's forces and relieve Tobruk from the outside. The plan called for British armour to break through Axis lines and link up with the Tobruk garrison, which would break out from the defensive perimeter and attack German forces from behind. Operation Crusader began in November 1941 and quickly developed into one of the most confused and costly battles of the North African campaign. British armour attacked German positions, achieved some initial successes, was counterattacked by Rommel's forces, and engaged in a series of running battles across the desert that lasted for weeks. The Tobruk garrison participated by breaking out of the defensive perimeter on November 21st, attacking German siege positions from inside, while British forces attacked from outside. The breakout was successful. The Australian and British troops linked up, officially ending the siege after 241 days, but the broader battle continued for several more weeks before Rommel finally withdrew westward. The siege of Tobruk was over, but its strategic impact was undeniable. Rommel had been forced to maintain substantial forces around Tobruk for 8 months, forces he needed elsewhere. His supply lines had been constantly threatened by the port's presence in Allied hands. His reputation for invincibility had been damaged by his inability to take a relatively small garrison. Most importantly, the defence had bought time. Time for British forces to rebuild, time for supplies to arrive from Britain and America, time to prepare the defences of Egypt and the Suez Canal. If Tobruk had fallen in April 1941, when Rommel first attacked, the Afrika Korps might have been able to push all the way to Cairo before British defences could solidify. Instead, Rommel was stopped, and by the time the siege ended, the strategic balance in North Africa was shifting against the Axis. The human cost was substantial on both sides. The exact casualty figures are disputed, but the garrison suffered approximately 3,000 killed or wounded, plus several thousand evacuated due to sickness. German and Italian casualties were significantly higher, with estimates ranging from 8,000 to over 15,000 killed, wounded or missing in attacks on Tobruk. The disparity reflected the defensive advantage the garrison enjoyed and the cost of attacking prepared positions held by determined defenders. But numbers don't capture the individual toll, the months of enduring terrible conditions, the psychological strain of constant danger, the physical deterioration from inadequate food and water, the trauma of losing friends to random shelling or air attacks. The veterans who survived Tobruk carried the experience with them forever. They had proven something important about themselves and about what ordinary men could endure when given strong leadership and a clear purpose. They had stopped Rommel, had held a position that everyone said was untenable, had conducted aggressive operations when conventional wisdom said they should be focused purely on survival. The Rats of Tobruk became legendary in Australia, their defence celebrated as an example of Australian toughness and refusal to quit, even in desperate circumstances. The nickname that was intended as an insult became a title of honour that would be remembered long after the details of individual battles were forgotten. For the German soldiers who participated in the siege, Tobruk represented frustration and respect. They recognised that the defenders were formidable, that the Australian tactics were effective, and that taking Tobruk was far more difficult than conquering the same amount of territory anywhere else in North Africa. Rommel himself acknowledged the quality of the defence, though it frustrated his plans and damaged his image of invincibility. The siege demonstrated that even the Afrika Korps had limits that brilliant tactics and aggressive leadership couldn't overcome, determined defenders holding strong positions with adequate support. The broader lesson of Tobruk was strategic in desert warfare. Ports mattered more than territory. An army could race across hundreds of miles of empty desert in days, but without ports to bring in supplies, the army would wither and die. Tobruk's location on Rommel's supply line made it strategically critical regardless of its tactical importance. A small garrison holding a forward port was worth more than an army in the field without logistics. This lesson would be repeatedly demonstrated throughout the North African campaign, as both sides discovered that advancing was easy, but maintaining advances without adequate supply was impossible. The siege also demonstrated the effectiveness of aggressive defence. The concept that defenders could and should attack, rather than passively waiting to be overwhelmed. Moorehead's tactics, the constant patrols, the night raids, the willingness to counterattack every German penetration kept the enemy off balance and maintained morale among defenders who might otherwise have become demoralized by siege conditions. This approach required confident leadership and troops who trusted their officers enough to conduct dangerous operations even when exhausted and stressed. But when those conditions were met, aggressive defense proved far more effective than passive fortification. The siege of Tobruk ended in November 1941, but its legend endured. The Rats of Tobruk had proven that Rommel could be stopped, that German tactics and equipment weren't invincible, and that ordinary soldiers defending terrain they believed was important could hold against enemies who were supposed to be unstoppable. They endured conditions that would have broken many units. The heat, the flies, the shelling, the bombing, the constant danger, and the grinding monotony of siege, punctuated by moments of intense violence. They didn't just survive. They fought aggressively, conducted offensive operations, and maintained the psychological advantage over besiegers who should have dominated them. Years after the war, when Australian veterans gathered to remember their service, the Rats of Tobruk held a special place. They had fought in the war's first successful defence against German forces, had proven themselves under conditions that tested every aspect of military and personal capability, and had earned a nickname that symbolised toughness and survival. The rats that lived in the holes of Tobruk, that endured the desert's harshest conditions, that attacked when they should have been defending and that refused to surrender, When every rational calculation said they were finished, these rats had changed the course of the North African campaign and proven that determination and aggressive leadership could overcome material disadvantages and terrible conditions. The siege of Tobruk was their finest hour, and they wore the title of rats with pride that would last for the rest of their lives.